I'm David Hecht. I'm one of the members of Remind, the group that is arranging tonight's little event. Just to start off with a little introduction, Remind is a group that's part of the Philoctety Center. It's of recent college graduates who were sort of plucked from the crowd by the directors here at the Philoctety Center to help extend the mission a little bit, which is, of course, to promote the multidisciplinary study of human imagination. And we're looking to include the sort of next generation of researchers and explorers of that realm. And we also are interested in the sort of more current topics and newer methods of exploring these things. So earlier this year, a group of us came together, including Jonathan Liebov and Cassie Kaufman, as well as Lee Kang and Kara Elverson, who will be here later, and myself, to try and bring together artists, journalists, researchers, filmmakers, politicians, and other people exploring these sort of outer reaches of the imagination in order to take part in some of these multimedia roundtables, as well as discussions online at the Philoctety's website. All the Philoctety's roundtables are available on the website, and so including the Remind stuff, and we encourage everyone to check them out, and also the online discussion, which we hope the participants and anyone else who's interested can take part in. We've already got a few interesting things going on there from the last roundtable, which was Left and Right, the Neuroscience of Political Thought. And we've already got a couple of posts for tonight's topic, so we hope you'll check that out. And we're also looking to, continually expand what we're doing. And so, both online and in person, we have a little bit of a sign-up sheet for anyone who's interested in either, contributing, taking part, or just staying informed on what we're doing that I'll pass out in a couple minutes. Let's see, this public speaking thing is part of why they put us up here. So I'd also want to express a bit of gratitude to the directors of the center, Dr. Edward Nersessian and Francis Levy, as well as the board members for boldly inviting the rebels into the palace, I think is what they ended up doing. And instead of a bloody revolution in the streets, they got events such as these and a series of events that we hope will go on and extending these things online and throughout all sorts of new realms. And their support and sagacity has been absolutely essential to everything we're doing. Tonight's roundtable is the second in our series on political thought and political psychology. The first, of course, was the Left and Right, Neuroscience of Political Thought. And the third is going to be next week on Wednesday at 7 p.m. It's entitled The Design of Influence, How Images and Words Sway Minds, which looks to be, again, a very interesting and hopefully topical discussion. For tonight, we're going to have some differences in terms of anyone who's been here before, what you usually have seen. We're saving the questions until the very end, and then we're asking that anyone who has a question can raise their hand, and the moderator will get you on up to the microphone as soon as they're ready to go for questions. And also, please, when you come up, introduce yourselves. We'd like to know who we're getting contributions from. Also, as part of our topical timing, tonight's other event is the debate, which is, of course, a very exciting and historic event. That'll be screened here and in the auditorium downstairs. I want to thank Adam Ludwig and Miguel Noguera for making that happen. In any case, I'd like to now introduce tonight's event. It's Voters and Friends, Group Influence in Individual Political Belief. And I'll let our moderator, Eric Dickson, tell you more about it, but by way of introduction for him, he's an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and the Center for Experimental Social Science at New York University. And his research applies game theoretic and psychological approaches to the study of elections, political communication, ethnic politics, and political violence. He's also interested in the evolutionary foundations of social judgment formation and decision-making. His recent work has been in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, British Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Theoretical Biology. Without further ado, Eric, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming this evening. My first duty is to briefly introduce my fellow panelists, and they'll each say a few words about themselves after I've gone around the table. starting at my right, we have Bryan Caplan, who is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University. He's the author of The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies. So you should buy it, and you should give me a share of the royalties. Named the best political book this year by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times. Next to him is Howard Lavine, who's an associate professor of political science and psychology at Stony Brook University. He's the editor of the journal Political Psychology and is a prior winner of the Eric Erikson Early Career Award for research achievement from the International Society of Political Psychology. At my immediate right is Jeff Merritt. He's the founder of Grassroots Initiative, the nation's first and only nonprofit election consulting firm. Prior to founding Grassroots Initiative in 2005, Jeff served as the executive director of the Center for Civic Responsibility, and he's also worked with the U.S. State Department and USAID-funded democratization programs in a variety of countries. And to my left is Kristina Hoke, who recently finished her second term as president of the Manhattan Young Democrats, a group dedicated to the education and empowerment of young progressive-minded New Yorkers. As if that wasn't enough work, she's also in her final year of medical training at the Cornell, Rockefeller, Sloan Kettering MD PhD program, and she'll be pursuing residency training in psychiatry after she's done with that. So maybe if we could just go around the table and we can all introduce ourselves in just maybe a minute length or so, and we can sort of jump into the conversation from there.
Okay. So I'm Bryan Caplan. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. I'm also a blogger at EconLog. I come from a department where maybe half of the economists are bloggers. So in terms of blogging per capita, we are the world's top economics department. Some people may consider that a negative, but it does make for some very interesting lunch conversations. A lot of this book comes out of my many lunches. If you take a look at the preface, I praise the institution of lunch and everything that it's ever given me. I've had many great lunches, and most of my great ideas come out at lunch. Any idea that I cannot defend at lunch, I give up, because if it does not pass the lunch test, it is not worth having. So the book, in a way, is the sum of many years of lunches with my colleagues who, while in some sense we're like-minded, if you just watch us, you would never realize this, because we never agree at all in public. Because as soon as there's a disagreement, well, no reason to keep talking about this. Let's move on to something else where we disagree. So, and let's see. In terms of what I'm doing right now, let's see. I've recently done a new survey that's trying to extend some of the work in this book, and I'm also starting a new book, which is on a totally different topic. It will be called "Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids." But we can talk about that in another panel, I guess.
I'm Howie Lavine. I'm, as I said, associate professor of political science and psychology at SUNY Stony Brook. I'm a psychologist by education, and I interloped into political science about a decade ago, but my work still really deals a lot in the sort of psychology of attitudes and persuasion. And so what I have mainly been doing over the past 10 years is looking at various theoretical ideas about when people are likely to change their minds or resist efforts to have their minds changed within an electoral context. I'm looking now at various dimensions of information processing, the way that the mass public sort of goes about trying to understand political candidates in elections. How much do they pay attention? How complex versus simple is their information processing? How much are they biased? What factors influence bias? How does that all kind of come together in the quality of their electoral decisions, which sort of influences the notion of democratic accountability and representation? And I'll leave it there.
My name's Jeff Merritt, and I run an organization called Grassroots Initiative. We're a non-profit, nonpartisan election consulting firm. What that means, in real simple terms, is I spend my days assisting candidates for offices, everything from the lowest level that exists here in New York all the way up to Congress. And what we do is all the kind of technical assistance we provide is free. We also provide publicly subsidized campaign material. So I'm going to try and at least give the perspective of a practitioner, letting you know kind of why candidates are doing what they're doing, what we're kind of advising them behind the scenes.
As was mentioned before, I'm an assistant professor at New York University. About half of my work is to do with applying game theory to the study of politics. As some of you probably know, game theory is a mathematical way of describing strategic interactions, which sometimes enables you to predict how actors might behave in particular kinds of settings. And about half of my work is what you might consider psychology experiments applied to politics, particularly focusing on political communication. So how do people listen to communications from... How do people listen to communications from political leaders? How do people learn from what leaders say?
My mother calls me all the time.
Sorry. I didn't mean to perform.
It's okay. How people learn from the sorts of things that political leaders say, how citizens update their political beliefs in the course of deliberation with one another when they're discussing political issues and things along those lines.
My name is Kristina Hoke, and as I was introduced, I was for 2 years the president of the Manhattan Young Democrats, so I sort of bring the perspective of community organization and being right out there, getting young people involved. How do you convince a bunch of 20-somethings to give up their weekends to travel to Pennsylvania to knock on doors for a political candidate, or travel to Long Island to do the same thing? And also, my PhD is in cell biology, and which has nothing to do with politics, or psychiatry, which I'm actually going into when I finish medical school this year. Thanks. So I've been downstairs in this building before, but not upstairs.
Great. So tonight's discussion, as was mentioned, is entitled Voters and Friends, Group Influence in Individual Political Belief. And so as a starting point for our conversation, so obviously at 9 o'clock we'll have the third and final presidential debate between John McCain and Barack Obama. And when we think in the abstract about how democracy works and how citizens decide who to vote for, I think the kind of idealized image we tend to have in our minds is something like a well-informed citizenry showing up at the Lincoln-Douglas debates and listening to skilled orators who advance philosophically well-formed and factually well-grounded positions. And then voters sort of weigh the conversation that takes place in politics and come to enlightened decisions and choose what candidate to vote for. That's the sort of classical story of democracy that we tell ourselves. Tonight we'll be talking about how membership in groups, or how being part of a social network influences political behavior and how people form beliefs about politics. So I guess one interesting way of starting out the conversation might be to ask the question from the point of view of your practical experience or your academic research. What are one or two of the most important ways in which reality deviates from the sort of classical story we tell about how democracy works and about how individuals form judgments when it comes to what candidates to vote for or what policy positions to favor? And maybe you can just go around this way.
Sure. Gee, where do I start? So, this general picture of the enlightened citizens listening to an intelligent debate and coming to some kind of reasoned judgment about it has been out of favor in political science and public opinion research for decades. Mostly what I've been working with is efforts to somehow save the conclusion, while admitting the obvious facts that most people are nowhere near at the level of what you might think of as going on at the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So I don't know how many people here know about James Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds. This is a book where he basically tried to appeal to statistics to say, look, and probably most people are way below the standard, but there's really nothing to worry about, because half the people will make one mistake, half the people will make the other mistake. The two groups will balance each other out, and in the end, it'll turn out the well-informed people are in charge, even though they're a tiny minority. Okay, so this is really where I'm starting. Then what I do in my book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, is take a look and say, hold on, is it really true that errors do balance out? As someone who actually teaches economics, one thing that's very striking is students often show up with very strong opinions about how the economy works on the first day of class. The first day of class of Econ 1. And they may even begin by saying, raising your hand, Professor, you don't understand. These are Chinese products coming in here, and it's the Chinese are selling this stuff, and you economists don't understand that. And this, I'm just trying to take role here, but it is striking how confident people can be that they've figured out how the economy works before they've even had a class. Anyway, being an economist, this made me inclined to think maybe there's something wrong with the Surowiecki story that error just harmlessly balances out. And a lot of what I do in this book is go over the evidence that, in fact, it is people who know very little generally do not flip a coin to make up their mind. They don't act as if they're flipping a coin to make up their mind. In fact, very often, it almost seems like they first find out what's true and then think the opposite, which can't be quite right. But there is a strange tendency of people who don't have any of the facts at their disposal to think the opposite of what people who study the subject for years think. Again, probably the most vivid example from economics is that if you take a look at people who have studied economics for most of their lives, something like 95% will say that free trade is a good idea, all things considered. And yet if you go and take a look at people who know nothing about economics, generally those proportions will be about reversed. There's something like 90% of people who've never studied economics think the free trade is a terrible idea. And it is striking that people who know nothing about it would have such a strong opinion, and yet they do. So this is the kind of thing that I talk about in my book.
Okay. Okay, let me just rephrase or repeat sort of the premise, which I think we all, at least everyone in the academic community who pays attention to sort of the notion of political competence among ordinary citizens sort of accept, which is the idea that people don't have either the skills or the interest to pay enough attention to politics to be able to sort of understand the ideological basis of partisan conflict, right? So we don't think, or often, most of us, most of the time, are not willing or able to understand how politics is sort of carried on at the level of elites, right, in Congress, or between the president and Congress and so on. So it raises the question: how can ordinary citizens make good decisions and understand what they stand for politically in some reasonable way, without having either the cognitive skills or the interest, right? So a lot of us who have the cognitive skills are just too busy, right? We get home from work and we have children and we put them to bed and then we're tired, and so it does raise a very difficult problem. And the way that political scientists have gone about this is to say, well, what people can do then is what they do in other spheres of their lives. They rely on shortcuts. Right? So instead of reading the New York Times, you just read the headlines. You get a lot from the headlines, believe me. And so then it raises the question: well, what are the, if we're sort of taking this notion that people are going to try and make good decisions, they'd like their political decisions to reflect their substantive values and their interests, but at the same time, they'd like to make efficient decisions. Those two values are generally conflicting. So how do they deal with that trade-off? Well, to add one more sort of problem is that people would like to not have to make any wholesale changes in their political beliefs as well, right? So then they have three goals. They'd like to make efficient decisions, they'd like to make accurate decisions, and they like to also preserve their prior beliefs. That's a lot to ask. One escape hatch, and the one that I think is accepted by most everyone, is the notion that our political party identification allows us, in many situations, to maximize all of those goals, right? Because we know that, well, a Democrat believes these things, and Republicans believe these things, and now that the parties are sort of better ideologically sorted, so that liberals are pretty much all with the Democrats, conservatives are pretty much all with the Republicans, much of the time we can make pretty good decisions without having to pay too close attention, right? So if you're looking sort of down the ballot at dog catcher, party ID is pretty much going to give you enough confidence to make a good decision. The problem is that we don't just simply belong or feel some affective, emotional bond to a political party, but we also evaluate the parties. Right? So that right now Republicans are sort of thinking, well, party brand isn't doing too well. We're not really performing well in the economy or in foreign affairs. Katrina and all of that. At other times, it's sort of the Democrats, and so what that does, it tends to undercut the notion that we can confidently rely on this very useful shortcut. So I think this is where the sort of the dynamism in sort of political cognition lies, right? So that when people feel like they can't really get enough confidence in their political judgments, relying on these very simple but powerful, often powerful shortcuts, then they will begin to think more carefully. They'll devote more cognitive energy, more time to making their political decisions. Again, depending upon how much they care, whether they behave or not, or whether their behavior reflects their substantive values and interests. And I'll just say one last thing about the sort of boilerplate boilerplate conventional wisdom. The notion, again, that people don't have the ability or the time is that there's a small stratum of society, the politically able, the aware, the sophisticated, the educated, and that small stratum, as Bryan was suggesting, really, their behavior is systematic. So, if the behavior of most of the mass public is sort of random, then they can move, they can move elections and they can move policy and so on, despite the fact that the rest of the public can't contribute. But it turns out that being sophisticated and educated and so on is also associated with being strongly biased. Right? So, for example, in perceiving the economy, which is generally something that we consider important to do, to be able to perceive reality, economic reality correctly, and sort of throw the bums out, or reelect them when the economy is performing well. Well, it turns out that the people who we rely on to be these sort of systematic movers are the ones who generally are severely biased in the way they see political reality. So they, in and of themselves, are not any great help.
So. Jeff?
One thing I think is interesting when we talk about this idea of how people make up their mind, and if they're watching this debate and it's a discussion and they're weighing the merits and the pros and the cons of these positions, is you're forgetting that when we watch a debate like the one that we're going to watch tonight, these two candidates are not going out there and just talking back and forth and having a general discussion. They're going after maybe 0.1% of the American population, and that that these candidates have already diced up the electorate into the different groups that they think make up their base, that they've categorized folks based on who's going to be solidly in one camp and the other, and put together the different target groups that they know they need to win, and then they're pushing messages specifically at those target groups. It's just simple kind of strategy to win an election. So what that means is it's not like everybody's getting the exact same general message that they're deciding about, which candidates they like. The candidates are purposely targeting messages very, very precisely and specifically to sway specific groups of voters. And so I think sometimes you just have to also look at the craft of this. And when we're working with candidates, we're not going to advise a candidate to just go out on the street and talk about general things, right? We're going to do the analysis of who the likely voters are and who the ones that they need to pick up, and they're going to create the issues. They're going to decide what messages based on, how those different groups break down, what different groups they belong to, and what the issues that those groups care about. So everybody's not getting the same messages. Everybody's getting very specific messages targeted to them, and certain groups are not getting, really aren't getting much attention at all, because we've already made the assumption that they're already in one place. So I don't want to, cause too much chaos here, but we just have to remember that sort of the general discussion isn't really so general. It's actually a very specific discussion that's being targeted at those people who are, kind of these swing voters in swing states, etc.
For me, one of the fascinating things about following an election campaign like this one is to go and read blogs of opposite political orientations after some event has taken place or after a debate has taken place. So I encourage you all tonight, after the debate is over, go to redstate.com, a conservative blog, go to dailycoast.org, a liberal blog, and try to see whether you can reconcile the two different planets that are described in terms of the events that will take place this evening through two very different kinds of lenses. And when I first started getting interested in these sorts of questions, I found myself going further and further back into the history of social psychology and the kinds of studies that were being done in the 1950s about, you take students from Princeton and Dartmouth and you show them clips of the same football game. And you ask them to count the number of fouls committed by players on each of these two universities' teams during the game. And what you see are that people tend to have very selective attention and focus on different aspects of the environment, whether it's a football game or whether it's a political environment, in a way that often tends to reinforce their predispositions. And one of the things that is tricky about trying to understand politics is trying to figure out what sorts of motivations people have that account for the particular weird way in which they end up sort of understanding the world, right? And so we'll probably talk later on in this discussion about things like social identities and motivations that people might have to, well, if I'm a member of one party, it makes me feel good to be in a party that has good leaders who are open and honest and know what's going on. And part of, I think, how people take in political information is very well described by what Howard said. In terms of people with limited attention trying to figure stuff out about the world. But I think part of the motivation as well is maybe not just trying to figure out stuff about the world, but trying to reinforce individuals' senses of self or other things like that in ways that can bias the information that people take in. And so, certainly I've had conversations, long-standing debates with old friends who have different views, where I'll make the same argument again and again, and the perfect, beautiful facts that I present are invariably forgotten by the next time the debate takes place. And I'm sure my counterparts would say the same things about me in the course of these debates as well. So understanding these aspects of individual psychology and what motivates people to pay attention to certain things in politics, to believe certain things that they hear and not others, is a sort of mystifying but really important part of this whole question.
I think my response will be sort of much less data-based and much more just my experience is much more limited. But from when we go door to door in swing states, we target undecided voters from the voter record. And so you get a chance to sort of have a long conversation with someone who hasn't made up their mind about who they're going to vote for. And I guess just what is striking about it are the sort of non-objective reasons that people are not voting or tend to vote or are begrudgingly voting for a certain candidate. Things as simple as, things like they don't like the candidate's spouse, or they don't like the way, that's a big one. Not, actually, this is more the last time around, but sort of people, even though you come to these doors prepared with a list of talking points and prepared with, this is why it's in your best interest as far as the economy, as far as jobs go, to vote for a certain candidate or versus the other candidate. It sort of seems to always come back to this emotional reaction that people have had to a candidate. Either they like them or they don't. And either they feel like warm and fuzzy around them or they don't. That's about all I have to say.
Yeah, great. So one direction this maybe points us in is, so if you look back at Aristotle and the rhetoric, there were three different ways that Aristotle described that persuasion might take place when you have a rhetorician speaking to an audience. And those were logos, pathos, and ethos. So logos corresponded in this, if we sort of translate these terms into the types of political speech we might see today, logos would correspond to things like logical arguments or presentations of things that are sort of policy facts to try to argue for why you should support one position or candidate. Pathos refers to what we might think of as emotional kinds of appeals that rhetoricians might make in order to be persuasive. And ethos might be translated into the sorts of concerns we see about character and things like that, with which the media and many voters are often very much obsessed. So in terms of trying to understand, from our different professional perspectives, the kinds of the mixes of logic, emotion, and character that actual voters tend to rely on in forming political judgments and making decisions. What's the sort of weight that you would put on each of these different kinds of characteristics?
So it has to add up to 100%, right?
It doesn't have. You can do Aristotle one better. So.
Yeah. 5 to 10% logos. 50% nomos, and the remaining 40, whatever, 1 minus those two for pathos.
I think half of each. Well, to say something dry and non-committal and academic. I'd say that it really depends, on the situation. By that, I think we could say, the election. I think elections vary so much. Think about, the election of 2000. Sort of who do you want to have a beer with election, right? So that was about aspects of character that were not, centered on sort of competence and leadership, and so on. But they were centered on sort of the other dimension of interpersonal liking, which was more or less, do I like this person? Are my feelings about this person warm or cool? Was this just a kind of a say my two words and go on?
Oh, no. This is sort of just a jumping off.
So maybe Bryan wants to have more of a crack at it too. But and then consider the election we're in now, right? So the election we're in now, I get the sense that Barack Obama is not moving people so much because people are getting warm feelings from him. I don't think he's moving people so much because people think, well, he has the right character. Yeah, he's been calm and collected, and by contrast to McCain, who's been, as the sort of ads have said, and I think a lot of people believe, somewhat erratic. He might be seen as having a worthy character for these times, but I don't think it's that either. I think this is the kind of election where people are really thinking that sort of logical sort of logos sense of Aristotle's sort of tripartite sort of breakdown. They might not be thinking so deeply about it. I mean, it may again be that they're relying on the shortcut of partisanship to say, well, look, I don't want the Republicans to run the economy at the moment because they presided over this horrible downturn, and because it looks as if the philosophy of deregulation has sort of driven this, and so I think that there is a lot of strong variation in terms of what the election is about. That said, I think there are some fundamental individual differences. So I did a paper just last year in the British Journal of Political Science looking at how much policy voting versus character voting sort of goes on, and again, sort of the boilerplate would be that people that are sophisticated would be drawn to policy, and other people would be drawn to less sophisticated voters would not be able to sort of understand these abstractions, and would therefore be more sort of character driven. And the story is kind of like that, but it seems that there's a tendency to sort of think ideologically that is separate from being sophisticated or educated or capable. It's partially related to that, but they share about 10% of their variance, to be again dry and academic, and those people, and again they are not numerous, maybe they're 15 or 20% of the public, they tend to be very strong on policy voting and not so much so on character voting. Those people who are both less sophisticated and less bent on sort of seeing the world ideologically will vote strongly on character if they're motivated to try and make a good decision, right? So they realize they're not going to get very far by relying on these sort of abstract considerations related to policy, which might be too complex for them to handle, or might just not be interesting enough. But they care about making a good decision, and so it's not only these sort of residual voters, but it's voters who really care about making a good decision, but are not either policy minded for reasons of political sophistication or for just their own sense of how politics works. And I think that is usually the majority of the electorate across elections.
I agree completely that it varies tremendously race by race, and it goes back to you're going to look at which those kind of key demographics are, those kind of swing demographics that are going to make or break this race, and you're going to put forward from a campaign perspective, we have the advantage of having lots of different vehicles to reach voters, right? We've got TV and radio, we've got newspapers, and we can, a lot of these races now is visual. You're going to incorporate certain elements into the way that you act visually for certain media. Obviously a still picture presents something very different than a TV camera versus an op-ed or something that's written in the, your statement that comes out from your campaign. So in every different sort of medium to reach voters, you're going to put forward, you might try to tap in more to people's emotions. And one, if you're, let's just say that women are a key demographic, right? And they decide that they want to put forward that soft, sensitive character for that demographic, right? They're going to do that through, certain mediums that are visual, that are on camera. Whereas for other demographics where they're trying to put forward the more logical, rational kind of perspective, they're going to do that maybe more in writing and that type of thing. So your campaign's going to put forward different elements. It's going to through different mediums, and they're each going to be targeted at different groups depending on who's most important to them at that particular time. So it definitely varies a lot on not just on a general election, but it's these two individuals when they square off against voters, who's in the middle there, and for those groups, what will appeal to them most, what will resonate most with them.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of you as well that I think across the context of different places and times, there's a lot of variation in the sorts of campaigns that people run and the sorts of things that voters tend to rely on in order to make decisions. And I think part of that is due to just exogenous features of the environment, right? So we're in the midst of a financial meltdown right now, and that gives voters incentives to think about the world in certain ways that they might not think about in the same ways if we were in different kinds of economic circumstances. So I think part of that is just due to whatever happens to be going on in the world at a particular time, and it's just sort of the roll of the dice of history in terms of what things are like in the period leading up to an election. But I think part of these things as well is determined by the kinds of choices that politicians make. So one of the things about a polity of any kind of size is that you have all sorts of different kinds of groups. So you have men and women, you have European American and African American and Asian American and Hispanic American voters, you have people of different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds, you have people of different sorts of religious faiths and beliefs. And I think part of the art of politics in terms of, as Jeff says, kind of identifying key demographics is sort of making strategic choices about trying to emphasize what kinds of group divisions you want to try to highlight in order to try to, skim off a few voters from your opponent to drag you up above 50%. And so I think some of the kinds of, what sorts of groups are important in a given election will be determined by just the exogenous circumstances. So if we're in the middle of a financial meltdown, that makes things like social class, socioeconomic status obviously more relevant. But a lot of these things are strategic choices by politicians as well. And we see in countries where ethnic violence breaks out, for example, that oftentimes you have strategic choices by politicians in making ethnic division salient, being a key part of the process that led to violence ultimately taking place. So I think that the whole story here involves something to do with the environment and what's going on, and something to do with politicians acting as entrepreneurs in a way, trying to divide society in a way that will be beneficial to their party or their particular sort of campaign.
I mean, I think I agree pretty much with what has been said so far, as it varies from election to election how much the gut plays. So it brought to mind an experience I'd had once when I was taking a campaign trip, and on the way to rally ourselves, we had a bunch of negative ads that the opposing campaign had put out. We watched them on the bus. We were like, this is a wonderful idea. It's going to rally the troops, see all these negative, horrible things they've been saying about our candidate. And we were just, after we watched them, we were all like, ugh, we don't even feel like doing it anymore. It was, even though we knew it was a bunch of baloney, that it still managed to leave you with this horrible bad taste in your mouth, and that really just drove home the power of sort of just negativity, even when you know it's a made up or it's a lie. It can still really affect you. And here in New York, we don't usually get bombarded as much with ads as people in other states do. But your friends and family who live in Pennsylvania and Ohio will tell you, they really are getting bombarded. But it seems like also this week it's sort of, there's been a lashing back against negativity, and I'm personally interested to see how that will come out in the debate tonight.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's something that Howie said that I think is very interesting and we're thinking about. So Howie was talking about the shortcut of party identification as a way of figuring out what to do. Now, I agree that people use it, although I think there's a very, very big doubt about whether it is actually useful on average. I mean, so the simplest story is, look, if it's useful for you to use your party ID, then it is in order to figure out how to vote, then it is negatively useful for the people on the other side to use theirs because it's actually pointing them in precisely the opposite direction. Now, the only way you could reconcile it and say that it's useful for everyone is if you were to say, well, really, it's only a debate about values. It has nothing to do with facts. So all the people need to do is find out people who share the same values that they do. But I think this really is an impoverished view of political conversation. A lot of what people are arguing about is what policies will actually be good for the economy of the country, what policies will actually bring peace. It's not just a question of values, it's a question of what actually is factually correct. And the way that people use party ID in order to resolve these issues, while they definitely do it, it's hard to actually see that it is on average a reasonable way of going about it. So because it never really comes back to the question of, well, did you choose your party ID wisely? And what exactly was the process whereby you figured out this was the one true faith? So again, I mean, you might think about the analogy of religion. I often like to analogize politics to religion because they are so similar in so many ways. So you might say, well, you're Catholic, so then you use your Catholic identification to know that the Pope is the person who knows what's going on in the world of faith. Say, well, that's good if we want to give a completely circular argument. However, what if we actually are not sure that the Catholic religion is the one true way? Then what would we do? And I think this is why we tend to overestimate how much reasoning is really going on, because a lot of it is just pseudo-reasoning. It is reasoning along the lines of, well, since people of my view have all the truth, I just need to find out what people of my view think, and then I've got the truth. Not really very effective in terms of actually getting answers.
How do we decide if it's a good decision?
Pardon?
How do we decide if we made a good decision?
Well, that's a good question. In cases where there is a definite fact of the matter, then it's wise to go and check what you thought before you saw the fact against the fact. In terms of if there's something still undecided, something that I'm a very big fan of is betting. Right, so my colleague Robin Hanson is brought a culture of betting to my department, where essentially anytime you say anything, you better be prepared to either put some money on what you said at the odds that you stated or change your mind. And this really is a very effective way of disciplining people and making people think about what they're saying. Next time when someone says, I'm certain Hillary will win, and I did hear things like this 12 months ago, and I actually had to be sarcastic and say, well, if you're really certain, how about I bet $1 against everything you own? And as far as you're concerned, that's equivalent to taking my dollar for free, right? So, no. All right, so I've yet to succeed in taking someone's entire life savings on the basis of a casual remark. But still, the ethos of betting is one of the most effective ways of disciplining people and getting people to not only define what it is they mean about what would count as being right or wrong, but also to second guess themselves and say, wait a second, am I really willing to put my money where my mouth is?
Well, I do think the question of what is the place of facts in politics is a very interesting question, right? And for a number of reasons. Right? One, because we like to think of facts as being important, right? We like to think that there's some sort of objective reality out there, and it's not just a matter, right, of we seeing the world from our own subjective perspectives and not being attuned to the fact that we could be wrong, or there could be something that sort of transcends partisanship, or is orthogonal, independent of partisanship, that like an economic turmoil that we're experiencing now, which is not wholly anything. It's partisan. And so I guess one question to raise is who is who is willing to absorb these facts? Who is willing to pay attention to them and incorporate them? And I think the way that voters, I think from a descriptive perspective, you're speaking prescriptively, what should voters do? And I think we need to keep our minds on what voters should do. And one way we do that is to think, okay, let's think descriptively in what they actually do, and think, well, who are the ones who move toward more prescriptive styles? And so to get back to partisanship and to try and sort of understand how people move away from it, because I think that really is the crux of the issue, right? Because this notion of partisanship has been referred to as a standing decision, right? That we've considered the variety of sort of policy directions that are possible and decided this is the direction that I think I generally want to go in most of the time. And so in many cases there really is little reason to think beyond that, other than when there is some nonpartisan crisis, which doesn't happen that often, at least in domestic policy. But as I say, voters also pay attention to the behavior of their own party. And they will be willing to move away from their party if the party is performing poorly, or if the party is not living up to the policy expectations or promises that it campaigned on. And so it's under those circumstances that voters tend to be willing to sort of throw their party idea aside and to pay more attention to the contemporary political environment. So there's a kind of a well-known theory in political psychology. It's called affective intelligence theory, and the notion here is that anxiety. Experiencing anxiety, that is, the notion that there's some novelty or threat or danger in the political environment that may have to do with, the emergence of some sort of exogenous fact of sort of social life, has the effect of leading people to reduce their reliance on political habits. And this is a notion that is sort of, linked more broadly to sort of neuroscientific or physiological functioning, right? That we have these sort of physiological monitors of the political environment, of the environment generally, and as long as everything is sort of expected and so on, we can rely on our habits in life generally, and we can make decisions sort of non-consciously or without much cognitive effort. But once there is some notion of threat that tells us to stop what we're doing and think about the most important thing to make a good decision, we will. And so, so elections that arouse a lot of anxiety, like this one, unlike, say, 2000, but also like 1980, like 1992, so that elections that are really about something, I think generally produce more voters who are willing to pay attention to the facts and to make decisions that, as I say, are good decisions. Good decisions in the sense of, understanding how the facts might relate to a political choice.
Yeah, I think that, I like the analogy of politics as religion, but I like it up to a certain point. It seems to me that different kinds of groups induce people to think in different kinds of ways to different extents. So for example, if we think about religious dogmas that are passed on within certain faiths, we see that certain kind of ideologies or ideas can be, transferred more or less intact for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we tend not to see political parties or political ideologies be transmitted in quite the same sort of way. And I think that part of what that ultimately gets to is that it's easier to change your political party than it is to, at least in most kinds of social settings, than it is to really change your religious affiliation, right? Which is often something that's embedded in a social context that if you grew up Catholic or Jewish in a Catholic or Jewish neighborhood, it's sort of part of who you are in perhaps a more indelible sort of way.
I mean, it's interesting, except if you notice, one of the hallmarks of modern religion is how most of the traditional dogmas have been, if not repudiated, they're just forgotten. We just stop talking about killing everybody who disagrees with us on something.
No,
I think a lot of politics is the same way, where the way that you get political party changes isn't so much they repudiate what they used to think, but they just forget about it or just stop talking about something they used to do. So you think about, you might think about New Labour in Britain. Mm-hmm. It's not so much that they're repudiating their whole tradition as we're just going to change our focus, talk about something else. And I think about this very similar to how, say, the Mormon Church has actually changed. We've changed a lot in just the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, so it's certainly true that any institution that's going to endure for any length of time has to be flexible to changing circumstances. And certainly, if you look at the study of theology and so on, you have religious texts that can be interpreted in different kinds of ways. And if you didn't have that, presumably the faith would be too brittle to survive as circumstances changed over time.
If you think about it, the other thing is with traditional religion, you had centuries where there was so little change that it was actually easy to keep things the same. Really, what's different about the modern age is both politics and religion do change more rapidly, just because circumstances change much more rapidly. You may be right that politics is more flexible, though. At the same time, as we've been saying, people are becoming people are becoming better. The ideological sorting of people by party is becoming stronger. So in a way, politics is becoming more of religion than ever.
But if things change so much, what are your criteria for a good decision?
I'll come back to a bet. Bets are good.
Well, there is a set of papers that look at something called correct voting, where they tend to look at. These are sort of done artificially as experiments, where they present people with it's called a dynamic information board, and so there's information scrolling from the top through the middle to the bottom of the computer screen, and you can click on that information, and you can learn about a candidate's positions on issues, the candidate's background, or anything you might learn in a real political campaign. And then in the end, you make a decision, and then you're shown all the information you didn't choose to look at or weren't able to look at, right? And then you are asked whether you would have made that decision, right, had you been fully informed. Right? And so if the answer is yes, that's considered a correct decision.
Sir, it says here group influence into individual political belief. Now, that's true. Group influence influences individuals to vote a certain way or whatever. But as somebody once said, that the British workers will never be free unless the Irish workers are free. Because the Irish work, and he also said that the workers in the United States will not be free until there's no longer any slavery. So I noticed that you mentioned nothing about class here. You only mentioned groups. You only mentioned groups. And yet, being determines consciousness, the same person said. What you are determines what you think. Not that that's true, because somebody else said that the ideas, the way people think, is based on what the rulers think. Because that's all they hear, or in the schools, in the churches, with their parents, you name it. So there's a certain amount of, I was really struck by Bush in this recent crisis because he seemed so small. I'm not insulting him, but when you had the big crisis, Paulson and Bernanke took over. And certainly McCain would have been the same thing, because he was even saying the economy was in good shape for a while. I tend to think that Obama, it would probably be the same thing. Maybe he'll have better advisors, but basically all this voting, in a sense, isn't it somewhat of a circus? Because we sort of know this question about intelligence, the most intelligent being the ones who will determine things, but the most intelligent work for who? Who do the most intelligent work for? So I think one of the weaknesses, and why would it be different here? Why would it be different here? And what is democracy? That's another question. Democracy for who? But this group influence and individual political belief, well, what about class?
Fine, what about class? Okay, let's talk about class.
What about class, Harry?
What about class?
What about class interest? Which is going on anyway.
Right. Why? Okay. That's a very interesting question because there, are.
We don't hold questions until the end of the session.
Okay, let's talk about class. There would appear to be two simultaneous class wars going on in politics. Right? One is economic, right, in which the Democrats are the party of populism, and the other is cultural. Republicans are the party of populism, and there has been some sort of contestation about among scholars and among the public generally about how much does economic class matter compared to cultural, class-related cultural preferences, and there have been. The answers have not reduced the ambiguity and uncertainty and complexity, of this issue, but they've pointed out a number of very interesting things. So we know some facts, but I don't know that we can understand or explain them. One thing we know is that there's a great deal of class voting, but it is in the poorer states, which tend to vote Republican. And so in those states, the more conservative people tend to be the ones with the money, and there is a very strong basis for class voting, stronger than in most European countries, in fact, apparently. In the rich states, California and Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts and so on, there apparently is no class voting. It's cultural voting to a degree. And so I guess for reasons that we don't quite understand, state-level factors can condition whether people are making decisions largely on economic class versus cultural preferences.
You're putting it all in the vote whether the electoral system. That's the problem.
Oh, Bryan? Yeah. It seems like you're referencing Andrew Ellman's work on this.
Right.
So, I've actually had a number of exchanges with him on my blog. Basically, there's a conflict between economics and political science in that economists expect that there'll be tons of class-based voting, and then when they see how little evidence there is for it, they're shocked. On the other hand, political scientists take it, at this point, almost take it for granted there won't be very much, so Gelman can get a lot of attention for finding patterns that nevertheless seem fairly small. It turns out that if you take a look at a simple graph, even there it's pretty flat. So if you look at, say, Democratic voting as a function of income, but then it gets even flatter when you realize that if you break it down by race, a lot of what appears to be poor, again, let's say about half, for example, Mississippi seems to have a very sharp tendency for poor voters to be more Democratic. But if you go and look at white Mississippians versus black Mississippians, then a lot of that goes away.
But not generally, no. I mean, his evidence is that, maybe Mississippi might be sort of an outlier state, but no, in most of the red states, race did not. I mean, it was just white voters. Very little fall off in the degree of class voting in the red states, in the poorest states.
I was talking with him, but I think he said about half over, on average about half. But the other thing that's interesting is that there's a number of different ways of interpreting class. So there's the simplest one of just saying your income is equals your class position. This actually is, for many people, probably not right. There's a lot of people who feel working class even though they're earning six figures, and there's other people who feel middle class earning minimum wage. So sort of another standard marker of class is, at least the people think of as education. Now, it turns out, in general, in public opinion, if you go and see what people think about policy, and you basically race, using their education predict their views against their income, generally education does crush income. It's not so, the example I like to use is if you go and talk to a PhD driving a taxi cab, and you may have actually been driven by some such PhDs in New York City, they generally think like other PhDs. On the other hand, if you have the self-made man who dropped out of high school, he generally thinks like other people who dropped out of high school in terms of policy. So you may think of education as capturing class, although I also tend to think about education as actually capturing information and just a deeper understanding of what's going on.
But the effects of education are not linear. Right, so that you become more Republican as you become more educated, until you've got a master's degree in education, and then you become massively Democratic.
And also the nature of class, I think, differs in the context of different sorts of countries. Right? If you look at a place like Britain, where you grow up in a certain social stratum and your accent is a particular way, then that's sort of something that is sort of a fixed marker that people will be able to pick out. I mean, conversation based on your background, and you're sort of stuck where you are. Whereas in other countries, class is a more sort of mobile construct that might have to do with present wealth to a greater extent than your origins, or might have to do with education in different sorts of ways as well. Thinking about sort of in consulting work or in political canvassing that the two of you have done, what sorts of, so when it comes to figuring out what sorts of groups are the demographic that needs to be appealed to in a given election, or in terms of fine-tuning the sort of pitch you give to different people as you encounter them in the course of canvassing. What are in this sort of city council elections where you've worked, or the sorts of districts where you've worked? How do you go about figuring these things out, and what are the sorts of group memberships that tend to be salient?
Yeah. I mean, it depends a lot on what type of race you're looking at. If you're looking at a race like presidential race versus if you're looking way down ballot, I think to a certain extent it speaks to how important this issue of how important party affiliation is and party loyalty is. Obviously, it's different when all Republicans are not created equal. A Republican in New York is very different than a Republican in Kansas, meaning that a Republican national candidate is going to be very different oftentimes to what maybe folks in a largely Democratic area like New York are used to seeing their Republicans like, right? And so it does depend on a race which different variables you look at. If you're looking at a national race versus a lower level race. I mean, generally what we'll do is we'll look at what the different races and who the likely voters are, and we'll start just analyzing them. So a lot of times, local level races, that type of thing, the races are going to be won in primaries where turnout is extremely low, so you don't go and look at the census records for an area. You quickly go in and you pull out folks based on their voting history. We can easily find out, for everybody in this room, I can know every election that you voted in. That tells me your likelihood of voting in the next election, whether it be a primary or a presidential general. And I'm going to analyze that group, and I'm going to see what jumps out to me. I'm going to see is that maybe the the district as a whole, the census shows that there's that it's very young and that type of thing. But when I look at those likely voters, maybe I find that 2/3 of them are over 60, and I'm going to look and see what the demographics that jump out. I'm really going to look at it, get as much data as I can in there. I mean, the big thing now that we see at a national level when folks have lots of money is this micro-targeting where you're bringing in commercial data, right? So traditionally we had to work with just what was on your voter registration card. Your first name, last name, which sometimes we can figure out your approximate race, ethnicity from. We know your age. We know if you're male or female. We know the area, the geographic area that you live in. So you've got those sort of real basic things that we can look at. But then when we calculate in that we might be able to match your name up against magazine subscriptions, we can start to learn a little bit about the types of issues you care about. Really, when you have a lot of money and you can tap into these commercial databases, we can do a lot more analysis, right? So it depends a little bit, but generally we're looking for things to pop out. We're looking to see what are the key groups that are in this set of likely voters, and based on past election results, those particular groups, which way have they tended to have gone, and are certain messages going to, let's just say, I realize that for a local election that the Caribbean population is an important group. Well, I'm looking at past election results and seeing what way those folks have gone, where their districts have gone, and figuring out the messages that I'm going to use to them, and if I can count on them to be, what my odds are at with those groups. So there's a lot of different kind of variables figured out here, but at the end of the day, it's not going out and looking at the census data or anything like that. It's looking at specifically who the people you're predicting are going to turn out, what makes up what groups they all can be divided up into, and then how can I create my campaign strategy so I'm hitting them with targeted messaging, that they're hit with the direct mail, that I'm out on the street in those particular neighborhoods talking about the issues that they care about. I think that's generally it, but it is definitely not the kind of big. We don't just sit down and say, well, I'm a young guy, and so I'm going to target young people. Not necessarily. I'm going to look and see how much of a force young people are of a voting bloc in my district.
Kristina?
Well, I guess I've tended to work on campaigns that don't have a ton of money. So we've just had the public data. So we go, and especially those people who maybe voted in the big elections but not the middle ones, we'll go to those people. So I don't really know, but one thing that's I think I found that's interesting about canvassing and phone banking is that kind of contrary to what I might have expected, is the older the people were, it seemed the more willing they were to kind of engage in more conversation, almost more, I guess. You might expect that young people, they see another young person, they want to talk with you, but it seemed like young people, most of them would sort of be like, I made up my mind, why are you here at my door? What are you wasting around your Saturday for? Whereas older people, you could really, in my personal experience, the older they were, they really wanted to talk, or maybe they just sort of wanted to air out. Pardon? Maybe, but there also seemed to be a lot of more malleability than I would have expected, and there's also just something about campaigning. There's something about being able to make a personal connection with the voter, and that makes a big difference. Now, I have a friend who on the phone, I just want to warn you about this guy, who on the phone, in order to help make that personal connection, which is really hard to make on the phone. I'm sure most of us don't get called because we're not in swing states, but when you do get called, it's annoying, right? You just want to hang up. So he'll see your name, and he'll be like, oh, I see your name's Kristina Hoke. I'm Bob Hoke, no relation. And he'll pretend like he has the same last name as you. But it's amazing the results he gets. When I'm hung up on over and over and over again, these people will talk to him. So it's not necessarily rational. It's sort of a personal connection.
Okay. So I think it's time for us to move on to questions. Yeah. So the way we're going to do this tonight is, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I'll call on folks to come on up to the microphone, and you can say your piece, and the rest of us will respond. Go for it.
Thanks again for all of this. I just wanted to, something I just noticed happening was that a couple of the points that the people who've been working in the field have brought out seem to be methodologically slightly different from the way that the academic approach is to studying these things. And I'm wondering if for the academic approach, how much of the more political methodology has been used in actually approaching studies of these various demographic variables crossed with affiliations, crossed with these other more cognitive variables, and do we learn anything from the way that the political people are approaching likely voters and looking at census data and seeing that? Does that inform when you cross it with the more academic approach? I'm wondering if there's some fertilization that happens.
Well, academics are certainly involved in this notion of looking at micro-targeting. All right, and they're interested in the notion of who is the persuadable voter, right? Who is, I think Bryan raised this at the outset, whose mind is open. Because we know that elections are about a fairly small sliver of the electorate, right? We know that more than half of voters already made up their minds before the candidates have even been selected, right, by their parties, right? Perhaps that's true for most people in this room, or many people in this room, many people everywhere. And so there has been a fairly intense interest in the question of who is open-minded enough to target. And so there has been some research looking at how micro-targeting works. And so the one theory sort of goes that, well, independents are very hard to reach. You're going to spend a lot of dollars trying to reach an independent person. So a lot of research looking at political advertising shows that you just can't move them. They're not going to pay enough attention. They're not interested enough to process the implications of what they're seeing to move. So who does that leave, right? So it leaves people who are partisans. And so what kind of partisans are persuadable? And so one answer to that question is that there are people who have a policy issue, have an attitude toward a policy that's very important to them, but that's inconsistent with their party identification, right? And so these are sort of cross-pressured or ambivalent voters, and that consultants purchase commercial data to try and identify who those pro-life Democrats, pro-environment Republicans are likely to be, right? Now, they don't know directly who they are, but they can infer who they are through rather sort of massive statistical inference, and then they go after them with direct mail. So that's one way in which academics are trying to look at that.
Yeah, another way, so a lot of this discussion is focused on persuadability, so who's open to maybe changing their mind. Another point of contact between academic exploration and the sorts of things that are relevant for people working in the field is the study of how you can actually get people to go out and vote. So a question of turnout as opposed to persuasion. So if you think about it, elections are sort of a weird thing, right? Because any one individual voter in a mass election is exceedingly unlikely to actually affect the outcome, right? So people, by and large, are not going to the ballot box with the expectation that their vote is actually going to decide who the governor of New York is going to be or who the president of the United States is going to be. So there are other sorts of factors that maybe determine the decision to actually decide to go and vote. And so one thing that Don Green, Alan Gerber, other people, especially at Yale, have done is to use experimental social science methods to actually figure out, well, what features of campaigns are helpful in encouraging turnout. So the sort of typical study along these lines involves randomly selecting households in some city and treating them with different kinds of campaign tactics and actually using public voter participation information. And as Jeff pointed out, it's perfectly public information how you voted, or not how you voted, but whether you voted in the last X number of elections. So actually randomly assigning households to get flyers or have face-to-face contact with a canvasser, and then actually go look in the public records to see the extent to which people randomly assigned to these different groups actually voted. So I think that's one of the more sort of practically useful points of sort of active academic research in the context of what people in the field might find useful to know.
And we actually have that book, and we read it, and it helps us figure out how many are we going to do robocalls. Those calls that you guys get where they it's a recording, and everybody hates those things, but when the researchers go out and they're doing enough studies, they find that there's certain ways that candidates can use them, and we actually use that, and it does advise what we do.
I mean, one of the things that I really like about academia is that while it's true that academics are doing the kind of research that's very complementary to what you're doing, but in academia you can also ask questions that would get you booed off the stage, such as, is it really a good idea to encourage turnout? On 2020 last week, I got a chance to give my 30 or 40 seconds from the safety of a studio. My basic argument being that we know that right now one of the main predictors of turnout is education. We know that more educated people in general have more political knowledge, more knowledge of economics, more knowledge of science. And it follows that if we could actually get 100% turnout, the typical voter would be much less informed than he is today.
Yeah, but voters that are more informed and more educated are also more biased. They tend to be stronger partisans, and they tend to be less willing to see political reality for what it is and more through a partisan lens. And so it doesn't solve the problem.
I would take issue with that. I mean, it is striking how often highly educated conservatives and highly educated liberals agree on things that the rest of the population disagrees on. Again, just going back to my stock example of free trade.
Yeah, but
Mostly it's in the opposite direction.
I mean, it might be that highly educated conservatives and liberals agree on certain things, but they vote in different ways. So.
Yes, although here's the key thing to keep in mind is that even people who are voting in very different ways, nevertheless, candidates know that the policy views of the electorate have changed. Both sides, you would expect them to adjust their platforms. So if both sides realize, hey, voters are now less educated, let's go and be protectionist. Even though at the individual level it might not be that their views are predicting even though it might not seem like it matters, it actually could, because even though there's not this direct effect on how they're voting, but the platforms that are being offered have changed.
So yet again, the interaction of strategic considerations in psychology. So another question from the floor? Well, I pointed at this gentleman, so yeah.
Okay, I just want to suggest what the questions are that you've looked at, and a couple questions you might go into a little more. Questions you looked at are why people vote the way they do, and you've come up with ideas like education, class, ethnicity. You didn't discuss gender and some of the other things. And then what to do to persuade people to persuade a vote change. And then you've kind of dealt with who is persuadable and mentioned voter turnout. But I think a couple of other questions that would be perhaps of interest. What evidence do you have, and this is something you can do research on, or you probably have done research on, that particular interventions work, and what sorts of interventions work? And then to go back to the other question I had, which I don't think you quite understood, so let me ask it again and make it clear what my question is. My question is really the criterion for a good decision. And when I'm talking about the criterion for a good decision, the majority of the country made a selection of the last president. The majority voted for him, and yet he's not very popular now. So would people consider that they made a good decision then, or would they now consider they made a bad decision? And so the point I'm really asking about is, how do we decide whether a good decision has been made? Okay.
Okay. I think one simple answer to that question, right, is to judge the various criteria by which people can make their decisions differently. To put more value on one way of thinking about candidates versus another way. So logos is more valuable than something else. Eros, is that the other?
Yeah.
I don't know what the Greek names were. And then having a beer, right? And so the one that political scientists, social scientists tend to elevate to, the level, the highest levels, the notion of policy voting, right? So if we can, operationalize the question of correct voting, right, to voting for the candidate whose policy positions you share, so that the policy direction of the country, moves in the direction that is consistent with the way you cast your ballot. That should be, I think, one answer. And so the question, is who is likely to rely on policy? And most people, most of the time, don't. And the way to get them to do it, right, is to undermine confidence on the sort of more efficient ways that people typically go about making their decisions, like party identification. And there are a variety of ways that can be done. That even well-informed people or people who are capable of processing a lot more information than they do won't bother because the divisive party ID is so efficient, right? And so to move them off of that, you have to somehow undermine their confidence.
Speaking of undermining confidence, I'd be curious to know collectively what you think might happen to voting patterns if there is actually a full-scale financial meltdown in the next 3 days, 5 days, which we seem to potentially be in the middle of. And in my memory, there's never been anything like this associated with certainly last half of the 20th century up until now, for a presidential campaign, and whether that really just makes that famous phrase, "this time it's different," just throw things a little off kilter.
Well, I think the sort of consensus view of analysts at the moment is that what's happened the last couple of weeks has been greatly beneficial to.
I just want to say one thing.
Oh.
I really would like you to restrict it in your own mind to what's happened in the last 3 days and last week. It's like that's all that matters, in my opinion, right now. Because I look at things like this, and I've never seen anything like it before, but I'm not an expert, and I'm not an economist.
So like I was saying, the last few weeks, the sort of consensus of analysts has been that this has been a big plus for the Obama campaign, simply because the Republicans have held the White House, and people tend to blame the incumbent party for things that are going wrong, and sort of given the state of the Republican brand at the moment, they're getting blamed for lots of stuff that's been going on, and presumably I would think that my suspicion would be that given that most voters probably don't understand at the micro level, exactly, what the LIBOR rate is, or these various complicated things in the financial market, and how what government regulations or deregulations might be helpful in a situation like this. I think at a bulk level, things being bad is bad news for Republican candidates, both at congressional and the presidential level.
Yeah, that's completely standard. The only additional part that I'm not sure about is, do bad times increase voter turnout? I'm not sure actually what happened in 1932. I think voter turnout was high, but I'm not sure. But I suspect that if there were any other effect, it would be higher turnout would not only hurt the party of the incumbent president, but would also raise turnout somewhat. But
so there's a tremendous difference in the outcome. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt won by a mile.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are there other questions from the floor? Yes, if you could come up to the microphone.
It's a simple question. I'm just wondering if you think we're well served by the length of our electoral process.
I would just say quickly that the election is, for all intents and purposes, 8 weeks, because most people who have made up their minds and are paying attention, for 2 years at a stretch, are not the persuadable voters who tend to tune in after the conventions.
I agree with that to an extent, but I think that so a candidate like Barack Obama, if the election were genuinely 8 weeks, would never stand a chance. And I think something about the 2-year process of, so maybe the vast majority of citizens aren't paying attention throughout the 2-year span, but people in the sort of opinion elite are. And if a candidate, is able to go through a campaign for 2 years and is able to seem sane and informed and not say too many crazy things over that 2-year process, that's something that probably tells us a lot about the person's competence, intelligence, and so on. And so I think that the sorts of candidates that might emerge from a process could be affected by the length of the campaign. And I think that in that sense, the fact that it's not actually 8 weeks probably makes a big difference. And depending on what sorts of candidates you like, that could be a good thing or a bad thing.
Can I just quickly?
Yeah.
I agree, Eric, entirely. But what I wonder, however, though, is a campaign that's 2 years long is going to move most candidates who cannot raise hundreds of millions of dollars sort of out of the right.
That's absolutely.
So somebody like Dennis Kucinich, who liberals tend to love, although they have no prospect of ever electing him, right? He and candidates like him, right? There'd be more sort of creativity, more diversity, presumably, right? Less sort of standard, party. Sort of.
No, that's absolutely true as well. And there are also, externalities for governance that if people are in campaign mode for 2 solid years, that probably has an impact on, the extent to which politicians are motivated to actually try to do things. I think we're out of time. Is that? What's that? So this is our scheduled stopping time, unfortunately. So I believe we're transitioning into debate watching mode. Thank you all very much for attending the panel, and we invite you to stay and watch the presidential candidates.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctates events is available at philoctates.org.